killing off our men. Our salvation, to a large degree, will be by mothers and wives who interpose themselves in order to save the family.
Dr. Tony Evans says while that's not preferable or desirable, it may be necessary.
When a man either cannot or will not fulfill a spiritual responsibility, the woman has the right to plug into that place so the home is still spiritually covered.
This is The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans, author, speaker, senior pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas, and president of the Urban Alternative. Dr. Evans says moms who believe God not only shape the lives of their children and the foundation of their family, but change the world. He'll explore some biblical examples today as we join him.
I want to talk to you about a lady that maybe you've never even heard preached on before. And yet she makes a faith act in Scripture that is quite significant and substantial. Her name is Zipporah. We find out about Zipporah and her great faith act in Exodus chapter 4. Zipporah is the African wife of Moses. God then calls Moses to this responsibility to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. That responsibility is highlighted in chapter 4, verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your powers, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you will say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go that he may serve me, but you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Moses has been given a responsibility by God. The problem is stated for us in verse 24. Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him, Moses, and sought to put him to death. So God meets Moses and seeks to kill him. And this comes right after God telling Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Then God goes over to Moses and seeks to kill him. Now let me explain something, Lucy. If God is seeking to kill you, you're dead. Anybody who can say, let there be light, and there was light? If he says, let thy heart stop, thy heart stops. So whenever God says he seeks to do something, but the thing he's seeking to do has not happened yet, that means you got a window of opportunity. So evidently, God gave Moses a sickness that would lead to death. And the reason I'm saying it's a sickness is because it became visible to his wife, Zipporah, that he was on his way to die. So it was like somebody having a terminal illness, and Moses is having a terminal illness because of something he did not do. It says in verse 24, it came about the lodging that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet and said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me because of the circumcision. So let me explain the problem. The problem is that Moses has refused to circumcise his son. And because of his refusal, God sought to kill him. Now that may not mean much to you, but let me put it in the Old Testament context. God gave Israel a rite called circumcision to place them under divine covering. It was a visible, symbolic act that was performed on the son because the son was responsible for carrying the covenant or the covering of God. That's why the definition of a kingdom man is one who operates under God's rule because he's carrying on God's covenant, which means he's responsible for covering his family. So watch this now. Moses is going over here preaching to Pharaoh about the firstborn while not taking care of business in his own house. All right? He's talking a good game out there while being neglectful in here. And because of his refusal to cover his family spiritually, therefore not circumcising his son, God sought to kill him. If God killed Moses, then that meant there would be no male covering for the family. If God would have destroyed Moses because of Moses' disobedience, the whole family would have been in trouble. So what Zipporah did was step in where Moses failed. So here's what I want all of you mothers to know first and foremost. Because I'm regularly asked by women, what do you do if you're married to a passive, irresponsible man? What do you do if your husband is not stepping up to the plate? What do you do if you marry a man who is unable or refusing to cover the family spiritually? Now, don't get me wrong. Moses had a job to do. He would be like a lot of men. He'd go to work. He just wasn't taking care of business at home. Zipporah steps in and does what the man of the house failed to do. Zipporah mans up because Moses didn't step up to the plate. In other words, when a man either cannot or will not fulfill a spiritual responsibility in the family that jeopardizes the family, the woman has the right to plug into that place so the home is still spiritually covered. That's not preferable. That's not desirable. But it may be necessary in order that the family, and in this case the children, are still covered. God is not asking you to sit back and do nothing under the misdefinition of submission. Submission does not mean being a fool, nor does submission mean being walked on. It is a biblical principle to submit to the legitimate authority of your mate. Now, it is preferable that the father oversees the circumcision. It is preferable that the father oversees training his sons to be covenantal kingdom men. That is preferable. That is desirable. That is preferable. But if the man cannot or will not perform the circumcision, that is, bring the boy up understanding his responsibility to oversee the covenant of God, then even though you're a female, you still have the responsibility and opportunity to raise up a boy to be a man because you give him a divine covering. So she steps in. This introduces to us a biblical doctrine called the doctrine of interposition. It is the doctrine of interposition where God will allow somebody to interpose themselves on behalf of somebody else. It is an intercessor. It is somebody who comes in between the righteous justice of God and the rebellion of people in order to divert the judgment. So the reason you interpose is to steer the judgment away that God has legitimately said is coming toward a group or an individual or a person to interpose themselves, okay? So it's the doctrine of interposition. This is what Moses does later on when God says, because of Israel's rebellion, I'm going to destroy them. Moses interposed himself between God and between rebellious Israel and says, God, slay me instead. If you kill them, then the enemy's going to say you were good enough to get them across the Red Sea, but you weren't good enough to get them into the promised land, and your name is going to look bad. It says when God heard Moses interpose himself between God and the people, God changed his mind. When Jonah interposed himself between God and Nineveh, it says God repented and changed his mind. Of course, the greatest interposition of all is when Jesus Christ died on the cross between a holy God and sinful mankind, so that the justice of God was diverted from us and placed totally on the finished work of Jesus Christ. That is a fact. All of us are going to heaven who've accepted Christ because he interposed himself between the wrath of God, the sinfulness of man, and God's wrath got diverted onto Jesus Christ. That's the doctrine of interposition. Well, guess what, mothers? Guess what, ladies? God gives you the right and the responsibility to interpose yourself, because the Bible says in the next verse, God let Moses alone. God changed his mind about Moses, not because Moses was doing right. He changed his mind about Moses because Zipporah was doing right. So God can use a woman to preserve a man. Now, I know some of you ladies said, I don't want to interpose. Kill him, God. Get rid of him. I don't want to deal with this. But she interposed herself. This is a New Testament principle too, by the way. 1 Corinthians 7:14 puts it this way. The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, so that your children are sacred. In other words, a woman can protect her children even if her husband is rebelling against God, because she situates herself under God and God responds to her even though God can't respond to him. That's why, ladies, you don't give up just because he has given up, because God will skip him, work through you, and judge him separately. That's not ideal. That's not how God has ordained it to be. But in many situations, as Satan keeps ripping off our men, as Satan keeps decapitating our men, redefining our men, as he takes control of our men, our salvation to a large degree will be by mothers and wives who interpose themselves in order to save the family. So Zipporah is a mother who interposes herself, and by an act of faith, it's what she did. Even though she was mad, it was what she did that saved her husband and kept the covenant going through her children and kept the covering of God over his house, so that God changed his mind about what he was going to do to the man.
Dr. Evans will be back with the story of another biblical hero in just a moment. First, though, I want to tell you about our current featured CD series and a special offer that's only good for a few more days. It's called the Spiritual Toolkit, and this 10-lesson collection will get you equipped to experience real success, genuine freedom, victory, deliverance, and more. It includes bonus material we won't have time to bring you on the program. And if we hear from you by next Wednesday, it's yours as our gift when you help keep the alternative coming your way by making a contribution of any amount, large or small. Just make your donation online at tonyevans.org, and we'll get a copy of the Spiritual Toolkit on its way to you. Again, that's tonyevans.org. Or call our 24-hour resource center at 1-800-800-3222, where there's always someone standing by to help you. I'll repeat our contact information for you later after Dr. Evans wraps up today's message. Let's join him.
Ruth is another woman who made a kingdom decision as a woman. Now, Ruth is a widow. Her husband has died. She's a Moabitess. She's a foreign woman. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, has lost her husband too. Her sister has lost her husband too. So you got 3 widows. Naomi says to the 2 daughters in Ruth chapter 1 verse 8, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Naomi, the mother-in-law, says to the two daughter-in-laws, go back home to Moab. Because if you go back with me to Israel, you might not be able to get married. Because you're foreign women. These are Jewish men. I don't think you're going to find a husband back if you come with me to Jerusalem. But Ruth said, verse 16, do not urge me to leave you and return back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. Naomi says, the only way you're going to get a man is to go back to the world you came from. Ruth says, I will take my risk on following you and your God rather than what I know would be a more logical possibility if I go back to Moab. And I know there are some ladies here debating the same thing. Do I go back to the world where I know I can get me a man? If I go back to the club, I know I can get me a man. If I go back, I know that I can find me a man at the club. If I go back to the world, there's going to be somebody who's going to want to hook up with me. But now on this Christian side, on this God side, where they got to be saved, and they got to be wanting to love the Lord, and they got to be wanting to be a spiritual leader, and they got to be, every time I find out what a Christian man's supposed to look like, my numbers shrink. Ruth said, I'm going with you. Don't tell me to leave. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. And I'm going to leave the results to him because faith deals with what you can't see. Faith is acting even though you see nothing that the action will produce. It's based on your confidence in the integrity of God. She goes back, and Ruth is gleaning in the field. And wouldn't you know it, in chapter 2, verse 5, along comes Boaz. Boaz said to his servant in verse 5, whose young woman is this? Translated in everyday language, hey. Then Boaz, verse 8, said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. It's like saying, listen carefully, baby. Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. A lot of fields out here you can glean in. I want you in this one. Don't go to another field to glean. Furthermore, do not go up from this one, but stay here with my maids. And every time I pass through the field, I want to see you. Don't go gleaning nowhere else. You stay right here. Now, there was a law called the law of the kinsman redeemer. The law of the kinsman redeemer said that the next person in line of your kinfolk could step in when there was someone who died to replace them as your mate. And that person was known as the kinsman redeemer. He could get back what was lost by death by marrying. Boaz was in line, but he wasn't the next in line. There was somebody ahead of Boaz. So when you read the story, you'll find out that the one who was next in line got kicked to the curb. Through a series of events, he was no longer the next in line, which put Boaz next in line. Let me tell you something about Boaz. Boaz was old, but not cold. Okay? He was a lot older man. So ladies, if a much older man comes looking for you, it's all right. He can be a cougar, you can't, okay? Boaz was older. So Boaz is older, but Boaz falls in love with this younger woman. And through a series of events, because he now qualifies through the sovereign providential hand of God, they get married. Now remember, when she started this, Naomi is telling her there's probably no hope for you to get married. But that's human opinion. That's what man can see. And that's what it may look like to you. But she made a faith decision to move in faith not move in circumstance. And this series of events turns around where Boaz now becomes her redeemer, the one who can buy her back, so to speak, into a relationship. Now turn to the end of the book, the 4th chapter, the last 2 verses, as we conclude. And to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse was born David. When we started 4 chapters earlier, we got a widow. She's by herself, no hope for marriage, got a mother-in-law. It's safer to go back home. And when you live by sight, you always play it safe. But when you live by faith, that means you got to take a risk because you can't see. So she makes a faith decision. My God will be your God will be my God, and I'm going to make my God your God. And she makes a faith decision that she acts on, goes back home with Naomi. Boaz sees her. In the last 2 verses of the book, we're given a little history. It says, Salmon gave birth to Boaz. But if you remember when we went over Hebrews chapter 11, we taught you who Salmon married. Salmon married Rahab. So Boaz's mother was a prostitute. When Rahab the harlot chose God, she went back to Israel. The builder of the city of Jerusalem was Salmon. Her past didn't destroy her future. They fell in love and got married. Rahab the prostitute gave birth to Boaz. Boaz is returning from Bethlehem, the city that his father built. On his way from Bethlehem, he crosses his field. He sees Ruth. Boaz and Ruth hook up. They have a baby called Obed. The same woman who couldn't get pregnant from her first husband gets pregnant from her second husband. Obed grows up, gets married, has a baby. That baby's name is Jesse. Jesse grows up, gets married and has a baby. That baby's name is David, who becomes the king of Israel. Fast forward to Matthew chapter 1, and it says, and David became the father of Jesus Christ. If you check back the lineage of Jesus Christ, you got folks in his line that don't belong there. You got a prostitute. You got a Moabitess who was of a foreign nature. But when you choose God, you never know how God's going to flip it, twist it, tweak it, turn it. You never know how God's going to do that thing. When you give him the opportunity and you trust him, even though you can't see him. There ought to be some Zipporahs here who slip in and say, I'm going to stand for God, whether the man is going to do it or not. There ought to be some Ruths here that says, I'm going to trust God, even though I can't see the result. And then you'll celebrate in however God chooses to make himself known in your situation as you celebrate the greatness of women who move by faith.
Dr. Tony Evans, with the powerful stories of 2 mothers who believed God. If you'd like to review today's message on your own or pass it along to a friend, it's available for digital download or on CD or DVD. Just visit us at tonyevans.org for the details. And when you do, don't forget to request Tony's featured CD series, The Spiritual Toolkit. As I mentioned earlier, it's available right now as our thank you gift if you can help us out with a contribution, any contribution, to help us keep Tony's teaching on this station and continue our work equipping pastors and connecting churches with their communities. Again, all the details are waiting for you at tonyevans.org. You can also call us at 1-800-800-3222, where members of our resource team are available day or night to help you. That's 1-800-800-3222. Faith isn't just a matter of what you believe. It really comes down to what you do, especially at those crisis points we all face. We'll see this principle come to life tomorrow as Dr. Evans tells us the stories of more mothers who believed God. I hope you'll join us. The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans is brought to you by the Urban Alternative and is made possible by the generous contributions of listeners like you.